Okay, good morning and good afternoon, depending on where you are listening to this. Welcome to an Ethical Corporation by Reuters event webinar on company purpose in the wake of COVID-19. I'm Terry Slavin. I'm the editor of Ethical Corporation, and I'll be moderating today's discussion. And I've got some great people here to share their insights in this interactive webinar, which is going to go for about an hour. So we've got Caroline Rees, president and co-founder of Shift, Daryl Brewster, who's the CEO of the Chief Executives for Corporate Purpose, CECP, Richard Ellis, who's Vice President for Corporate Social Responsibility at Walgreen Boots Alliance, and Melissa Anderson, who's President and co-founder of Public Good, which is a consultancy. A little bit of housekeeping. On your right-hand side, you'll see a box where you can post your questions. So please do post your questions throughout the discussion, and we will try to get these answered. So Mike Barry, who is formerly at M&S, who architect of Plan A at M&S, wrote in a recent column for us that the COVID-19 pandemic's an acid test for companies to turn the management speak of purpose into reality. He said that unlike the bailouts of the banks after the 2008 crisis, society isn't going to accept companies which have been bailed out by governments to return to the old ways that left their supply chains and workers so exposed to this crisis. He says companies that will prosper in the next decade going forward will be the ones who pay their taxes, cut dividends, pay their taxes and then cut dividends and executive pay as they receive bailouts. They'll do the right thing by their customers and employees, and above all, they'll be socially useful and relevant in all that they do. So, of course, this is dependent on them surviving the economic downturn that's going to follow COVID-19. And the question to me is, to what extent the crisis might also give rise to purpose washing, as cash-strapped companies play up their immediate response and deflect attention from the fact that they aren't actually changing how they do business. And going forward, will there be enough economic headroom in companies to continue to address issues like climate change and the SDGs, or will they be more internally focused on their employees and supply chains, which have been really rocked by COVID-19? So to discuss these and other issues that I'm sure other people have and will want to raise, I'd like to start with Richard Ellis of Walgreen Boots, and to talk about what Walgreen Boots has been doing as a company. You've really been on the front line of the response. Richard, can you tell me what you've been doing?
Well, I suppose COVID-19 is really no different to our normal day-to-day work, which is basically around helping people live healthier and happier lives. And we want to help protect people, help our customers and our employees. And so that part of our work hasn't changed. And clearly, our pharmacists are a key element around the world in the delivery of healthcare services. But this is clearly something which is unique in the way it's impacting so many people, and I'm pleased with the way that our people have responded and the way in which we have collaborated with others, whether it be governments, the National Health Service, our suppliers, to try and ensure that people are receiving medicines, the right sort of protective equipment, and things like testing centres. So in the UK and in America, we've set up testing centres for health workers so they can know whether or not they've got the viruses. So very much this has been a collaborative effort, and I think it shows what is possible when everybody comes together and tries to tackle something. And I think the way in which on a Thursday night in the UK we've applauded health service workers is indicative of the way we're all pulling together. And I think this is one of the things that perhaps we can learn going forward is how we collaboratively tackle problems that we face.
Richard, we've just had our first question come in. So I'll ask it of you. It's from Peter Shelenik, asking, do you agree that what's happening now is an existential crisis? And will companies like Walgreen Boots need to reconsider your reason for being, namely your purpose? Has this crisis actually, do you think it's going to change the track that you're on?
I think we will certainly, like all companies and all countries and governments, we will learn from this. I think the key thing for me is that we have to start thinking and make sure that what we do, in other words, our actions, are absolutely in line with what we say in terms of our marketing messages. I think that we will have to work harder at demonstrating our value to society. But I think in terms of Walgreens Boots Alliance's role within the communities that we serve, we are still going to be a provider of health and beauty services and products.
Okay, that fair enough. I mean, here's another question. People are doing my job for me. How do you think, this is from Pauline Rutter, how do you think health business will walk the line between running a successful business in time of a pandemic and not unduly profiting from the crisis? Hang on, that may be a different question. Sorry, I think that I attributed that to someone else.
I mean, I think that our customers will have long memories, and if they see that we or any business is exploiting them, then I'm sure that when we return to normal, they will take their business elsewhere. And that's why we are being very careful to make sure that we are there standing side by side with both our customers and our people to make sure that we are behaving and doing all of the right things so that we are a part of the solution, not one of the problems.
Okay. Sorry, this is Pauline Rutter's question. Did Walgreen Boots have a contingency planning for this type of emergency? And if not, what could this look like in the future?
I think, yes, we do have contingency plans, but not on this scale. So for argument's sake, when the hurricane hit Puerto Rico, we have a contingency plan for dealing with that, and we have a whole mechanism that rolls into place to support that island. But we don't have a contingency plan for the entire world. And perhaps we can learn from the military, where every 6 months or so there seems to be some sort of military exercise involving the forces of NATO or other countries. So they are clearly preparing for wars. Perhaps what we should be doing is starting to prepare for these sorts of emergencies. I think earlier in the year in Australia they had the terrible bushfires. they couldn't have been predicted, but could they have been better planned for? You look at Hurricane Harvey, Hurricane Dorian. They were both absolutely devastating once in a century activities. So I think that perhaps we're being given a warning by nature that we should take more care of the planet that we inhabit, because in 2050 there are going to be 9 billion people on this planet, and if we consume resources in the way that we do at the moment, we're going to need 3 planets worth of resources, and clearly we only have 1. So if we don't look after the planet, then these are the sorts of things that are going to become regular occurrences. And clearly, what we're going to have to do is to think more carefully about how we respond to these sorts of things. So yes, we do have contingencies in place for things like hurricanes, but in terms of something which impacts upon every community, every country that we operate in, then there has been a certain amount of swinging into action and putting in place an infrastructure to then support and to deal with all the things that we have to do.
I mean, your role as a CSR professional, I mean, has this changed, do you think, as a result of this crisis? It's often seen that CSR professionals aren't really given, often don't have a seat on the board. They're not really in the C-suite. Do you think that this is going to actually elevate that role for a lot of companies?
Yeah, I mean, I'm very fortunate in terms of the access I get and the involvement that I have in the day-to-day operations of the company. So I'm very happy with my role. I think that what has been happening over perhaps the past 18 months is that the CSR agenda has been brought very much more into focus, and I think a lot more companies are starting to take seriously things like carbon emissions, plastics, water usage, and so this is becoming much more centre stage. And I think that COVID-19 is only going to accelerate that process. And I can see that CSR professionals are going to become much more valuable and much more of an asset to the companies where they work and where they operate.
Okay, I've got another question. I'm sorry?
Yeah, no, this is Daryl at CECP, where we work with well over 200 companies and their CSR and corporate citizenship leaders. And like Richard, we're seeing that these roles which were already on broadening their scope, moving up into the organization, have become even more important over the last few weeks. I mean, this COVID-19 has been faster, vaster, and it's going to last longer than I think a lot of people anticipated. But we are really seeing a lot of these key roles stepping up, because they are the connection often between the companies and the communities they serve. And while companies are in very, very different situations, some looking to survive, others we're seeing stepping up. Roughly half the companies we've surveyed are now adding to their social investments here to really help come out of this area in a bigger way, be able to respond more quickly, to be able to help advance the recovery. And I think beyond that, we'll see a reinvention of business and its role in society. It was already happening. I think we're going to see that this is going to really accelerate that as we move forward.
Maybe I should ask the other members of the panel their views on this. Melissa, what do you think?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I think that one way to think of it is the CSR role going to be elevated? And another way to think of it is I think there has been a trend around CSR not being to the side, but being core. I think about Paul Polman and removing that as a department and saying We are all in purpose now, and it's systemic. So my hope is that it's not as much that CSR is elevated, but this trend that we've been seeing is accelerated, so that it really becomes part of the fabric, and that the brand and the KPIs that roll up are all around, kind of taking into account a purpose and CSR focus. Does that make sense?
Yes, yes, it does. What do you think, Carolyn?
Yeah, I think to a good extent, I would agree with that trend. I think at the same time, we do see is that companies that already had the right reflexes there are the ones that are tending to see that this capability within their companies to think about those external impacts and their management and how to prioritize and react the right ways. Those are the ones that are getting it most right most often. And those that had not developed that same reflex are perhaps the ones that have been stumbling and fumbling in their immediate responses and seeing some backlash from that. So to that extent, one might hope that the lessons drawn from that will indeed be a further reinforcement of the idea that having these capabilities, taking seriously these capabilities around what constitutes responsible business as a part of how the business needs to function at its core and not at the periphery, it will hopefully be seen as being essential going forward.
Has anyone seen any companies that have not been part of this church of CSR, kind of taking this on board, or seeing some kind of light as a result, or maybe more recently, just because of the Business Roundtable discussion on, reevaluation of the purpose of a company?
I think it's certainly some companies have really accelerated their efforts in this space. Part of it was how they were have been affected or impacted by COVID-19. So for some companies, if you're in the travel industry, your customer base just disappeared. So you have a different set of issues. What we are seeing is companies that were in the center of the store, traditional grocery and supermarket products, which had been struggling for a while. They have really, ratcheted things up where they're really finding themselves in the food, ag, healthcare business as being really core to being part of an essential service to the industry and to broader society. So we are seeing differences of that emerge. We're still very early stage in this, right? Companies are just responding and reacting to get this moving, but we are seeing the seeds set. We work with, again, 200 companies. We're literally having companies meet by industry, by issue, by geography, and the learning and sharing happen has been really remarkable. Again, 8 out of 10 countries find businesses responded better than their government. Think about that, right? 8 out of 10 have seen that because government businesses responded pretty quickly, but there's still a long way to go here as we move from response to recovery and hopefully reinvention.
That's interesting. That I guess that question to you, Richard, because you've been working with different governments, haven't you? You've been working in Europe, you've been working in the US, and would you say that? I mean, what do you find easier, dealing with governments, dealing with other companies?
I mean, from our point of view, obviously there's the NHS in the UK, and this doesn't exist within America. I think the big thing that we found is that there's been huge amounts of collaboration, whether it be with our suppliers or the NHS, and I think that it's this collaboration which is key to the way in which we're able to tackle the problem, and I think that everyone recognises the seriousness of what's happening, and is very much getting on with the task of saying, how do we beat this thing? So I think I would say that we found it positive in terms of all of the dealings that we've had with all of the various stakeholders, and I think we've found working with charities and NGOs. I mean, people who are trying to help people in society who are struggling because they're homeless, and that we've been able to work effectively with those to provide product that perhaps we're unable to sell at the moment, so that it goes to a good home rather than being landfilled. And I do get a sense that that there is a much greater willingness and preparedness for organisations to come together to fight COVID-19.
A question from another listener, George Mail. How can private sector actors influence how stimulus funding is expended so as to drive a more resilient economy? We saw, well, for example, in Europe, we saw yesterday a large number of companies joined the 180 signatories to calling for a green recovery in Europe, and saying they would collaborate towards a green recovery with green, so that we're addressing climate change as well as the ravages of COVID-19. George is asking, should we require that companies receiving funds comprehensively assess their ESG impacts and establish plans for improvement?
Yes, I mean, I think that's fair and reasonable. I think that what we've always found is that we enjoy positive relationships with governments because we operate with governments in a way that is completely transparent, and I think that gives us, because we're in regular dialogue, it puts us in a stronger position because we're taken seriously. I think where there becomes a problem is if suddenly companies are jumping onto a bandwagon and seeing this as being an opportunity. I think from our point of view, we are in serious dialogue with governments around the world on an ongoing basis, and we always have been, and we will continue to be so. And I think that the way in which we have responded, the way in which we're dealing with governments, will help us in terms of creating more positive dialogues as we move forward.
What's your take on that, Daryl? What are your members?
Yeah, I think there are certainly some differences here between what happened in the last downturn, and it does vary quite a bit by industry. And some industries are bringing in funds to survive, travel industry, things along those lines. A lot of the programs right now have really been built based on employees and how do you really keep employees engaged and working. And I think we're going to hear more and more from businesses about how we really establish those focus areas. Is there a few industries that have been hit very, very hard that have received specific funding? Yes. Is there some political aspect to this? There are some of those, but I think as a general rule, what we're seeing is the companies are stepping up, recognize that they have a real role to play in this, and they're going to want to see, they're going to be asked, what did you do during the COVID-19 crisis? This is kind of a real challenge for this era, and I think we are seeing a lot of companies step up on that. Both the big companies that we work with, I also work with a lot of mid-sized companies, but just did a board call yesterday, and boards which are not always so open, totally understanding this and saying this is about the safety of our employees. It's about keeping people to work, and this is not about the cost right now. I mean, this is not a time to figure out how you're going to make the quarterly earnings. This is about a time to really go back, assuming you're in ability to survive, right? If you have enough cash, that's really key. That's the price of paying. Once you move that, you can kind of move up Maslow's hierarchy to see how companies are really having an impact on their employees, their communities, and certainly their supply chains and their customer base. So I think we are getting companies at different stages. We are at an early phase for this whole effort, but I think companies are looking to see they do have a responsibility. One particular industry I'll point out that maybe didn't do as well last time was the banking industry. They were the ones surviving. They're really stepping up. Many of the leading banks have now said everybody who's working with us has a roll through at least the end of 2021. They have been pretty rapid in some of the loan programs that are happening in the States. Still some confusion on that, but it's been a matter of days that's gotten going. So the banks, I think, are stepping up. And also good to see some of the auto providers, which last time benefited, are really stepping up, like GM on the making of ventilators and others. So companies that perhaps were benefited last time or were rescued, bailed out, those are the ones we're really seeing stepping up because they were in a better position to be able to respond to this current event, even though that might not have been their industry, right? Making ventilators on the GM lines is pretty remarkable stuff.
Do you think they'll also are we seeing, and I think Paul Polman was saying in this in an interview I did with him, companies that are looking to try and have a bit of a trust deficit, say Facebook, some of these companies that have had some issues on trust, seeing this as an opportunity to rebuild that trust?
Yeah, I think you could look at that in a couple of different industries, and industries that perhaps saw themselves to really have a bigger opportunity there. So I think we've seen that in some of the tech companies. Mentioned the financial services industry, the notion of major insurance companies, auto insurers here in the States, that have basically, knowing people aren't driving as much, have provided benefits back to their customer base. Didn't have to do that, but I think that was an area that I think was planning, if you will, positive trust into their own bank account, if you will. So I do think companies are seeing this. I don't think they were expecting this. I don't think they wanted this to happen, but I think are seeing this as an opportunity to really kind of step up in areas to be seen as a good corporate citizen.
So what about what's your view, Caroline?
Yeah, I think we've seen a great deal of innovation and stepping up, as Daryl says. I think in each of these areas of looking at the kinds of impacts that are occurring, and as being reflected, they're quite different by industry. Everybody's looking, of course, at health and safety of their immediate workforce, but those industries where a lot of the impacts are on the livelihoods of people suffering from a collapse in demand versus those, as with Richard's company, where it's higher demand and so perhaps higher stresses. These are really different kinds of impacts, and I think that the critical difference between those getting it right and those not getting it right in the first instance is attention to and sort of a reflexive going to caring for those who are most vulnerable. So even when one looks at that sort of classic category of employees, we've seen that push towards focusing in on those who are on the lowest wages or who are on the hourly pay structures, those that have the least resilience in their domestic incomes. And I think that's been salutary to see the companies that are focusing on them first. We've of course seen calls from investors to say you've got to be taking that top level pay cut amongst executives before you're looking at laying off and furloughing those on the lowest salaries. There's an expectation of focus towards the most vulnerable, and looking also to those who are on contract, who are in the gig economy, who work in practice for a company but are on different kinds of relationships with that company, and recognizing where they're more exposed in health terms, maybe because they're delivery drivers, or they're more exposed because of the or existing insecurity of their work. And in supply chains, you see the difference between the companies that have been using a force majeure clause to just reject paying of any suppliers, including those that have completed orders, versus companies like H&M and PepsiCo and others who are looking to pay the smallest suppliers first and fastest, faster than they normally do, recognizing the greater reliance. There's a huge difference in those two kinds of response, and ultimately, it comes back to who is thinking about who is most vulnerable in this ecosystem I'm part of, and that includes the workforce. It includes, for many of these companies, their supply chain as well, and a recognition that not only do they have an impact on the realities of these people in value chains through the kinds of decisions they're making at this time. But they are increasingly recognizing the underlying dependency on many of these people that has been there. And this crisis has really brought that to the fore. So I think there's a great deal that we can celebrate in the reactions that we are seeing. I think there's been some what we would call peer norming. I think it's great to see as Microsoft was so quick off the mark in saying we're going to keep paying hourly workers in our canteens and who keep our campus running. That pushed others in their industry to have a similar response. I think it's really important as we see companies being public about what they're doing, that it for those who maybe had a slower reflex or haven't quite got there yet, that it pushes them in that direction as well. So I think there's to celebrate. There's also, and then we can't overlook it, those that haven't response right and have looked first to the shareholder dividends and protecting the senior pay and using the force majeure clauses. And I do think, that they already to some extent are, but will face more of a reckoning. And that's even, accepting, of course, that there are genuine trade-offs to be made in this, and there are companies who have really very few options. But nevertheless, I think we will see some pressure after this to say that the new norm needs to be that we continue to look at those who are most vulnerable and to recognize our dependency amongst those who historically have been more invisible in these business ecosystems and value chains, but who today are on the front line.
Well said. This really put that focus, that spotlight on the front line now, which is it did not happen enough. And I think we've seen that particularly with retail workers, people working in the factories, making the products that are so essential, as well as those who are delivering the healthcare, right there. So I think that has really helped us understand these key roles and the inner engagement that we have across our various supply chains, both on a national and a global basis.
Melissa, what's your take on all this?
Sure, thanks, Terry. Yeah, you kind of started this by hitting on trust and what companies are doing around trust. And I think it's worth kind of pointing out some data that's come out of the Edelman Trust Survey on COVID, which is some of really the newest data responding here. And that data showed that this is a time of low trust for people around government and media. And brands are really beginning to play, there's an opportunity here. There's a trust void here. So there's an important role that brands can play as communicators. First by acting as a reliable news source. Their data is showing that people are looking to their employer first as the most reliable source about what's happening with COVID. How is it progressing? How are we responding? Not only in the workplace, but even more broadly. And then second, people are looking to their employer and are looking to brands to offer instructional information about COVID and how to protect against it. So I think that, when we think about this kind of trust void, if you will, there is absolutely an opportunity here for companies to step up at a leadership position. And again, the Edelman data is showing people are looking to them to step up to the leadership position. So for those that do, I think that there's a great opportunity to improve trust, whether you're coming from a Facebook perspective where there's been a historical lack of trust, or you're coming from a brand that has a more solid trust footing kind of coming into COVID.
But isn't there a risk, I guess the purpose wash risk, that you play up your response to this immediate threat posed by COVID-19 without really addressing long-term issues in your business model, for example?
Yeah, I'm really glad you brought up that piece. And I think that, look, when we think about trust and communication, really we have to take a step back and say, step one is that it's critical for companies to step up today, support their stakeholders in meaningful long-term ways, not short-termist. And, also saying that most brands have some undesirable practices, but step one is having a long-term strategy to help stakeholders. Without that, you're right. It's going to be, you could call it COVID washing, you could call it purpose washing. But, for the sake of today's conversation, kind of assuming that that step one has taken place, then I think it's really interesting to think about, assuming that authentic effort is in place, then how can brands navigate kind of purpose and communications without looking like they're, say, call it COVID washing? Is that helpful?
Yeah. There's another question about the difference between what is, purpose and what is the response to COVID-19. What is CSR, and philanthropy? Where does it fit in? Is this coming out of philanthropy budgets, or is it coming out of CSR budgets, or where do companies place this?
We have actually done some research on that. If I can share some of the highlights, if you want.
Sure.
Sure. What we found is that about half of companies are adding this to their. This has happened at several levels. First, there's things happening on the core business as people deal with their customers, their supply chains, their employees. So that's where much of the work is happening. Beyond that, as we move into communities, those who are being underserved, we're seeing companies come up with new innovations, new collaborative efforts to help to address those activities. We're also seeing additional funds flowing in from either a redeployment of some of the funds that were spent in traditional corporate philanthropy or social investment, but also for about half of the companies that we've had, they're actually increasing that. So retaining all that they had done, plus adding additional funds in there to address the issues we've seen with COVID-19. So it is, again, a mix, different companies in different ways. As we've gotten underneath that data, again, your business situation made a big difference. So if you're an industry that got just hammered, you just don't have the flexibility that others have. But we are seeing a lot of companies taking that additional funds to really focus those in those areas. I also thought the comments there about how the game is rising as companies hear what others are doing has been very prevalent. We're again having conversations with companies on a daily basis by industry or by geography, and it just is there's a race. I'm not sure it's a race to the top per se, but there's a race to kind of keep up with where others are going, while others are really taking a lead role. And so I think that's a very positive sign that we're seeing, at least right now in the response phase. As we move toward recovery and reinvention, those represent real opportunities, I think, for business to really live and to stand up to that purpose. Right now, it's very clear, here's what we've got to get done. How we move through this will be one of the great next challenges.
Okay, Carolyn, maybe you can, what's your perspective on this? What are you seeing? Maybe explain what Shift does. Might be helpful.
Yeah, sure. We're a not-for-profit organisation, but we work with companies directly as well as investors, civil society organisations, to make respect for human rights part of how business gets done. So for us, it's really not about philanthropy. It really is about core business. It really is about understanding who is most vulnerable in our workforce, in our value chain, upstream, downstream, around our operating sites, who is most vulnerable to impacts from how business gets done by us and our business partners. And how do we mitigate that? So, inevitably in a crisis like this, there are aspects that will be philanthropic, and that's necessary and great and welcome. But not if it's, I think it's the purpose washing comes if it's happening whilst not looking at the core business, not looking at whether the response in the context of one's own workforce, in the context of the supply chain, is at the expense of those who are most vulnerable, rather than looking first to protect them from the fallout of business decisions. So it really does need to go to that core business prospect. And I think that plays back a little bit to the discussion we were having just before about business models. We had been doing some work, still are doing some work around what we call business model red flags. We are looking at features of business models which are typically cross-cutting across more than one industry, that carry inherent risk to human rights. And when they get embedded in business models, it's actually no good telling your corporate responsibility team or your social compliance team to go and manage or mitigate that risk, because you've made it a part of how the business operates and will continue to operate. And so one needs to be aware of those. It's not that they can't be dealt with, but they have to be dealt with at the level of strategy, at that top level, rather than at an operational level. So we've been doing a lot of work with different industries to explore those aspects of business model that carry inherent human rights risk and how to address them. But what we're seeing in this crisis is how they create vulnerabilities for business as well in many instances, right? So you're seeing the kinds of models that are increasingly around just in time, which build inherent risk for people into them, are often the most vulnerable, are also creating risk to business at times like this. We're seeing how those very difficult to trace supply chains are much harder to compensate for in times like this, or those that are overly concentrated often in areas where protections of workers are lesser, again, create risk back for the business, where pricing and the way that value is distributed in a value chain squeezes out liquidity and resilience for smallholders and small suppliers, create real business continuity problems at times like this. So there's a really interesting moment here where I do think that some of these business models that we've been calling out because of their risks to people are demonstrating that they create a lack of resilience for the businesses who hitherto have perhaps seen some advantage in those strategies. And hopefully post this, there will be more of a reckoning around some of that, and a realization that actually, if you're looking at sustainability, if you're looking at medium to long-term value creation, these models do need to change. They need to adapt in order to protect people and in order to recognize that that's in the interest of business too.
So in the aftermath of the Rana Plaza disaster, you had all these fashion brands coming together for the Bangladesh Accord to agree collaboration agreement to try and lift safety standards in the garment industry. So can we see scope for that kind of collaboration between companies to try and make things more equitable in their supply chains, say raising up, bringing living wages, rather than competing so much on ever lower prices?
Well, you're right, exactly. That was an example that was already there, of enlightened apparel companies, very much led at the CEO level, saying that, you know, we need to take the wages of the workers in the factories making our products out of the equation of the things that we're competing on when we're negotiating price. And, you know, because otherwise it becomes the easy pinch point. It becomes the easy default for it to get pushed onto their wages, unpaid overtime, subcontracting to facilities that aren't safe, or use children and so forth. So that very much was an initiative working with the union to say, how do we structure industry level collective bargaining in geographies like Bangladesh, like Myanmar, in order to be able to be confident that workers' wages are not the element that gets squeezed every time as we compete. These kinds of initiatives that look at these structural problems, that look at these, in that instance, it's a sort of it is a business model feature within the industry. How do we mitigate that? How do we take that out of the equation? How do we adapt? So that's not the reality. We're going to, I hope, see more of that. I think we need to ensure that we see more of that. And what's heartening in many of the responses now is the extent to which we see others in government, regulators, investors, wider society, adding more and more voices to the expectation that we think about these vulnerabilities and apply them. We've been doing work with retailers and logistics providers, so the last mile drivers, well before COVID-19, looking at the acute vulnerabilities that these drivers face without paid leave, let alone sick leave, and the human effects that has on health and safety and other human rights related issues, and helping in those discussions to talk through what should be the shared expectations from retailers, of logistics providers, and what are the reasonable approaches to be expected logistics providers as they look at the risks to their drivers. So these collective conversations are really going to be critical in looking at these systemic problems and problems that are absolutely rooted back into shared business model features.
So maybe asking Richard, in the case of Walgreen Boots, are you part of any such collaborations? Are you part of industry collaboration? Are you trying to address some of these issues across your industry at all?
Well, yes. I mean, I think Walgreens Boots Alliance has taken these things seriously for some time. So modern day slavery, the UK regulations apply across the whole of our business, where everywhere in the world has adopted modern day slavery. And so for us, this is much more business as usual. This is core business. And from our point of view, we are making sure that even though we are making more demands on our suppliers, that those suppliers are continuing to respect the basic human rights. And from our point of view, we publish all of this information, we place it into the public domain, and we work with others to share this information. I think that for some businesses, this will be a bit of a wake-up call. For others, it's more business as usual. I think that one of the key lessons that people have to learn is that what they say has to be matched by what they do, and I think this is a great example that the public will have long memories, and they will remember those companies that were actively involved in supporting the communities across the world, and those companies will subsequently, I think, do well. Now, you can support and help in many, many different ways. So, for argument's sake, my colleagues in Boots donated 200,000 hygiene packs to NHS workers so that they could have a wash and feel normal. Different businesses are able to help and support in different ways, and I think that it's important that all businesses do whatever they can to help in this unique situation.
Okay, we've had a fair number of questions. Sorry, there are so many questions I can't possibly ask them all. But there have been thematically, one of the big questions is whether the climate crisis, what's going to be the impact on the response to other issues like the climate crisis? Are companies going to use this response possibly and this complete upset, we are going to be quite focused on public health over the next while. Will some companies be using this to maybe hide the fact that they're not doing so much on climate, or to downplay what they'll have to put some resources more into local community issues rather than wider issues like the climate crisis? What's your, Daryl, maybe?
Yeah. No, look, again, companies are going to have to deal with a response to the situation on the table right now. I think the challenges then are going to happen as we recover, as we reinvent. What are the steps that are being taken? And I think there's a few things that we're hearing here that I think are very powerful. One is industries coming together. We've seen this in the utility industry in the States and others, that industry associations that for a while had been lobbying for advantage to their industry are now looking to set standards for sustainable business. So we're seeing that particularly in the utility industry, consumer brands and others really raising the bar. We've talked about that in the fashion industry and other places. More of that needs to happen at an industry-wide basis so that these areas that have generated negative externalities, that's not how you make money and how you outperform. Those are set as standards, and you win on other dimensions. Will vary by industry. I think the second area of this is our call, which we have at CECP, is that each company, every company, should share publicly its long-term sustainable business plan, which ought to talk about its corporate purpose and how it's going to engage with its significant stakeholders, as well as address its material, environmental, social, and governance factors. We've had that. We've done them. We've had 8, 9 different forums where CEOs have shared those plans. Paul Polman, my friend who we've talked about, came over. He shared his plan. We've had European CEOs do that, CEOs from the States and others. So that you really have a set of, here, are we ready for what's going to happen? We certainly have to address the current issues. And within that context, I think the climate issues, where it's material for an organization and a company, needs to be part of that. What are those material risks that we face? Some of the companies we've done that have responded best, people like NRG, an energy company, they had a whole pandemic strategy ready to go. They've done it. The remarkable job. We don't give a lot of credit to the utilities that have kept the power on. So as people are sheltered at home, the internet, like we're having now, is working. So things like that were really great. And we've heard from those companies talking about the work that they've done. And then because it's all public, we can hold them accountable for that. So I think those two areas, industry collaborative efforts to raise its standards and individual businesses laying out those sustainable plans, will be ways we can begin to address these issues. I think it's premature to say now that if people are just going to deal with COVID-19, they can't deal with climate. They can do, and they're going to have to do all these things, but we need to lay those out, and then we need to hold companies accountable as we go forward.
What about?
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think if you look at plastics, I think the business community is starting to realize and really understand that if we can solve the issue of plastic, then it will be of benefit to everyone rather than just an individual business.
Except from what I've been reading on circular economy is one thing that's really going to take a backseat for a while. That a lot of these initiatives, to try and get away from single-use plastics have all just been abandoned over hygiene concerns.
Well, there's going to be trade-offs, right? That's what we have to understand here. Is how do we begin to make those very powerful trade-offs that we're having there? And is there therefore the role both of collaboration or innovation that gets us both the hygiene that we're looking for, as well as reduce the impact that plastics can have? That level kind of adaptation and innovation that we're going to really need to look for by industry and by company as we move forward.
Melissa, what's your view? How do you see this playing out on the climate and circular economy agendas?
Sorry, yeah, I was muted. I think that what COVID-19 has done is it has thrust an incredible level of urgency across, obviously government and with companies. And I think that with climate change, the crisis is, it's going to take some pushing, I think, of companies and industry to move as quickly with the climate crisis. As Daryl said, you have to deal with what's on the table. And right now we're in the midst of the biggest pandemic we've experienced. And so all hands on deck there. My fear is that given the climate crisis is a longer term, slower burning issue, it's going to take a back seat. And again, I think there's going to need to be some pressure to create the type of urgency that we naturally have around the pandemic.
But where do you think that impetus is going to have to come? Is that from governments, or do you think as a result, because obviously governments are taking a much stronger hand in this response now? In the UK, you've had the Tory government who has really actually nationalized much of the economy, completely taken the labor agenda. But just in order to respond to this crisis, do you think the legacy is going to be more big government and the willingness and collaboration with governments and business?
As I polish my crystal ball, I think it's going to be business that leads here. I think that that's what we're seeing with COVID-19, and I think that business will need to be pushed as the industries will need to be pushed, but there's a number of great collaborations, like Caroline has talked about, where leaders of industry are really coming together to say, look, something has to be done around climate change. And I think that to the extent that those collaborations can become stronger and push the entire industry to come up, that's where we're going to get the most power, versus relying on the government.
Terry, this may be a difference between the U.S. and Europe on this as well, but I think in the States, people are going to be looking for business to take the lead. And I think some of the longer-term strategic investors in the capital markets who are seeing that the companies that were ready on ESG have actually done better over time, and even in the current circumstances, because the businesses, they have resources, they actually listen to data, not the political winds, and they're able to adapt faster. So I think not that there isn't role for government, there certainly is, and good government can make an enormous impact and raise the bar here. But I do think we're going to expect the innovation largely coming from the business side, particularly in the States. That may vary in other parts of the world.
Yeah, agreed. And double down on Daryl's point around investors. To the extent that investors are changing the way they're viewing ESG, I think that's going to be a tremendous force for change.
There's on the G side of ESG there was a question about whether the FairTax agenda, if investors are going to actually start to really push companies to pay their fair share of tax and stop, the way a lot of companies are structured is to minimize the amount of tax they're paying. Who wants to take that one?
Yeah, Caroline here. I mean, this has to be a fundamental aspect of it. We know that the build back is going to be painful. We know that there's a huge reliance on government programs right now. And, to the point of the importance of the role of government, I do think as we look across certain European economies compared, for instance, with here in the US, where you have robust administrative capacity to get the money out fast to where it's needed, it makes a real difference to where that capacity has been corroded. So I hope and that there is more of a reckoning of how important that administrative capacity and expertise where we need it really is at times like this. The taxation, I mean, absolutely, that it simply isn't tenable to assume that the support that's going to be needed to assist the millions of people left with the legacy of this in their lives, in their livelihoods, can be handled in any reasonable way and time frame, unless government has the wherewithal to do that, and that comes through the tax base. And so part of being a responsible business absolutely has to be looking at how one is treating tax, paying tax where revenue is generated, not seeking to use the loopholes, and recognizing that we can't keep saying that it's the job of government to make sure these protections are in place if we're not providing the revenues that they need in order to pursue that. So it has to be an absolute mainstay of what we expect going forward.
How realistic is that, do you think, Daryl? Do you think that yes, ESG shares have proven more resilient, but isn't the priority just, I mean, it's going to be, so many companies are going to go to the wall. There's going to be how can we expect markets to be more long-termist in view if it's going to be such a struggle just in the short term to try and get companies get on their feet again?
Yeah, I think when we as we've gone through and we've assessed past downturns, the companies that are smarter invest now with the resources they have, and it depends whether you're in a survival mode or not, as we've mentioned. Those companies tend to emerge out of the downturns faster and tend to outperform as time goes on. There will be consolidation in certain industries. It's going to happen. It happens in every downturn. At the same time, there also is a huge rise in innovation during these times as well. And we've seen that. Tom Friedman, the New York Times, has published a great piece on the amount of innovation that came out of the last downturn. So that will be sort of the side that I think we need to hold out some hope for. that we'll begin to see some innovative efforts that are coming out of companies to address a lot of these challenges and issues. And that's, again, why we see this as being a phased approach right now, phases of response right now, getting ready for the recovery, but a real opportunity for reinvention. Some of the companies we're talking with now are truly thinking about reinvention for the future. Others are trying to figure out how they're making payroll. So that's going to help. It's going to be separated here over the coming months and quarters.
Okay, I'm afraid we're out of time.
Man, keep going.
It's gone really quickly. But maybe if I could turn to everyone in turn to just give their final thoughts on, pick up any theme you want and just say what you think the legacy of COVID-19 is going to be. Shall we start with Richard?
I think from our company's point of view, the legacy will be the way that our people have responded to it. All the things which they have chosen to do to help and support their communities, whether it be manning the testing stations, whether it be working in nursing homes, providing meals, and the way that they have responded as a body has been amazing. And I think that it's credit to them. And I know our company is not alone in that many businesses have seen their people go above and beyond what might be expected. And I think from my point of view, it's something which it's always I'm not surprised at, but it's just the extent to which our people have responded and the numbers and the different things which they are doing.
That's Daryl. Did you want to? Take
I think it's so well said by Richard in terms of people on the front line. I think as we think about it with our CEOs and leaders of companies, I think the question will be, what did you do as a leader during COVID-19? How did you handle that? And then what impact did that have on you and your company being a force for good in the future? I mean, I think those will be the two questions that are going to be asked for this generation. I think it's that kind of an impact it's having on us.
That's great. Caroline?
Yeah, I think, we already had this big dialogue going on about stakeholder capitalism that was really coming to a head before this all hit. And I think, many were both on board theoretically, but also bemused at stakeholders then seeming to be everybody. And I think what this is showing is that it's not everybody, it's the most vulnerable. Whether you're talking about your workforce, your supply chains, your customers, communities, it's about the most vulnerable. And if we understand stakeholder capitalism to be about looking at those who are most vulnerable as affected by your business, we'll get it right going forwards.
Fantastic. Melissa.
Great. Yeah, I would love to build off of Daryl's point that, the legacy will be, what did you do? How is your company a force for good? And I think that, as we've seen the data that I talked about earlier, people are looking to business to communicate about what's happening. People are looking to business to tell them what they can do and how they can help and how they can change behavior in this time. And so to the extent those businesses that step up around communication, around helping people take action, those are going to be the brands that are going to thrive and, in my view, increase market share and come out of this stronger potentially than they came in.
Fantastic. So basically, it's step up or get out of the way, and that's what companies are.
I think so.
Companies need to remember that they're going to be, measured on what they do at this time. That's great. It's been a fantastic discussion. Thank you, everyone, and thank you to all the questions from listeners. Unfortunately, I could only ask a small fraction of them. We will be tackling these and other questions in our next magazine, actually, looking at COVID-19, both some thought leadership and also from some journal, some of our great journalism looking at the different implications So thank you all, and have a good rest of your day.
Thank you, Terry. Thank you for your leadership
Thank
on
you.
the call.
Okay.
Bye, everyone.